My name? It doesn't matter anymore. You won't find it in any official records, not after what I've seen. I've been erased, scrubbed from existence like I never mattered in the first place. But that's what happens when you get too close to the truth. They make sure no one ever hears your story. Unless, of course, you have nothing left to lose. It started more than 20 years ago, back when I was a fresh recruit for the CIA. I wasn't looking for glory or power. I was just good at my job. Cryptography, data analysis, the kind of skills that get you noticed by the right people. Or, in my case, the wrong ones. The call came on a rainy Thursday evening. I had been working late decoding a batch of intercepted transmissions that seemed too routine to matter. The phone on my desk rang, the shrill tones slicing through the quiet hum of the office. On the other end was someone I didn't recognize, someone who didn't bother with pleasantries. "You've been reassigned," the voice said, flat and devoid of emotion. "Report to room 147B tomorrow at 0800 hours. There was no discussion, no opportunity to ask questions. Just a dial tone and the slow realization that my life was about to take a sharp, dark turn. The next morning, I made my way to room 147B. The hallway leading to it was different from the others, colder, quieter, as though even the air itself was keeping secrets. The walls seemed to close in on me as I walked, and my heart thudded in my chest, each step heavy with dread. Inside the room, there were no windows, just a small table and 2 chairs, one of which was occupied by a man in a gray suit. His face was expressionless, but his eyes held a cold intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "Sit down," he ordered. I did as I was told, my mind racing with questions. Who was this man? What had I done to deserve this kind of meeting? "I'll be brief," he said, sliding a file across the table. "You've been selected for a classified assignment, the highest level of clearance. We believe you have the skills we need, and more importantly, we believe you can keep your mouth shut." I opened the file and my stomach dropped. Inside were grainy black and white photos, images of objects that defied explanation. Some of them looked like aircraft, but not like anything I'd ever seen. They were sleek, metallic, and unnatural. Before I could speak, the man leaned forward, his voice low and deadly serious. "What you're about to learn goes beyond anything you've been taught, anything you've ever imagined. The government has been in contact with extraterrestrial life for decades, and we need people like you to help monitor that contact. You're being recruited into an elite covert unit within the CIA. Your job will be to decipher communications between us and them." I stared at him, my mind spinning. Aliens? Covert units? I had always suspected there was more to the world than what we were told, but this? It was too much, too fast. "You're joking," I said, my voice betraying my disbelief. He didn't smile. "This is not a joke. You've been chosen because we believe you can handle it. But understand this. Once you're in, there's no getting out. You'll be watched, monitored. And if you ever so much as breathe a word of this to anyone outside the program, you'll disappear permanently." I swallowed hard. "And if I refuse?" He leaned back in his chair, a shadow of a smile flickering across his face. "Refusing isn't an option." And just like that, I was in. I signed the papers, swore the oaths, and entered a world I had never known existed. A world of shadowy operations where the truth was buried so deep that most people would never even know to ask the right questions. In the days that followed, I was briefed on everything. The history of extraterrestrial contact, the deals made behind closed doors, and the surveillance programs designed to track every encounter, every sighting, every signal that came from beyond our atmosphere. But there was something they weren't telling me, something darker, more dangerous than mere surveillance. I could feel it in the way the higher-ups talked, in the unspoken tension that hung in the air during every briefing. There were gaps in the information they gave me, files that were classified above my clearance, faces I wasn't allowed to see, questions I wasn't allowed to ask. I should have turned back then, should have found a way to walk away before I got in too deep. But curiosity is a powerful thing. It's like a disease, eating away at you until you have no choice but to chase it, no matter where it leads. And so I did. I followed the breadcrumbs they gave me, digging deeper into the secrets they tried to keep hidden, learning things that no human being should ever know, things that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I had no idea in those early days just how deep the rabbit hole went, but I was about to find out. In ways I could never have imagined. You always think you've seen it all. As a CIA agent, especially in the cryptography division, you become numb to secrets. Government cover-ups, black ops, foreign espionage. None of it surprises you after a while. But when I was finally brought into the real heart of the program, I realized just how naive I had been. And I was 3 months into my new assignment when they showed me the truth, what I now call the discovery. It was supposed to be a routine briefing. My superiors had been keeping me on the edges of the real operations, only letting me see glimpses of the extraterrestrial contacts we were monitoring. I had become familiar with strange radio transmissions, signals we couldn't decode, and unexplained objects that appeared on radar for mere seconds before vanishing. But this time, I wasn't just going to be a passive observer. They were finally letting me in. The briefing room was dark as usual, and the air felt heavy, like it was full of secrets no one should ever hear. A tall man in a military uniform stood at the head of the room. I didn't recognize him, but that wasn't unusual. People came and went in this division, their identities never revealed. You learn to stop asking questions. "We're going to show you something," the man began, his voice calm but cold. "What you see here stays in this room. Do you understand?" We all nodded, myself included, though my mind was already racing. What could they possibly show us that we hadn't already been exposed to? UFO sightings, strange aircraft, classified experiments. The lights dimmed, and a large screen flickered to life. What played out on that screen changed everything. It began with footage from a military operation filmed in grainy black and white. Soldiers moved through a thick forest, their guns drawn, their faces set with grim determination. In the distance, a strange light flickered in the sky, bright, pulsating, and unnatural. "What you're seeing is footage from 1986, the man narrated. A special ops team was sent to investigate a crash site in a remote part of the Amazon rainforest. Initial reports described a downed aircraft, but when they arrived, it became clear that this was no ordinary crash." The footage zoomed in, revealing a metallic object partially embedded in the ground, smoke rising from its surface. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Smooth, curved edges, no visible seams or rivets, like a single piece of metal had been molded into an impossible shape. The soldiers approached the object cautiously, their movements tense. As they neared it, the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate, and a low humming noise filled the air. One of the soldiers touched the surface of the object, and immediately, he was thrown backward by some invisible force. The footage cut out abruptly, and the man in the military uniform turned to face us. "That object was of extraterrestrial origin," he said, his voice steady. "We've known for decades that we are not alone in the universe. What you saw in that footage was just one of many incidents we've covered up. But there's more. He clicked a button and the screen shifted to a new video, this time a recording from inside a dimly lit room. In the center of the room, under a harsh spotlight, sat a figure. At first glance, it looked human. But the longer I stared, the more I realized something was off. The proportions were wrong, too tall, limbs too long, the skin unnaturally pale. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It just sat there, perfectly still. "This is what we found inside the craft," the man said, his tone now heavy with something darker, fear maybe, or awe. "We've had it in containment for over 30 years. It's not alive, but it's not dead either. Our scientists have run every possible test, but they can't figure out what it is or where it came from." A chill ran down my spine. I had heard rumors, of course, whispers among the lower-level agents about the bodies we'd supposedly recovered from crash sites, but I had always dismissed them as conspiracy theories, the kind of stories that circulated among those looking for attention. But here it was, right in front of me. Proof. "We call them Greys," the man continued. "They've been visiting Earth for longer than we've been keeping records. They don't communicate with us in any way we understand. Their technology is beyond anything we've ever seen. And they're not the only ones." He clicked the remote again, and the screen filled with images, photos of different craft, different beings. Some looked vaguely humanoid, others were grotesque with insect-like features or reptilian skin. I felt a sickening sense of dread wash over me. This was real, all of it. "The Greys are the ones we've had the most contact with," the man explained. "They seem to be observing us, though we don't know why. They've made no attempt to communicate directly. But we've intercepted their transmissions, and we believe they have an agenda, one that involves us." I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. Every image, every piece of evidence shattered the fragile reality I had clung to for so long. Aliens weren't just a possibility. They were a fact, a terrifying truth that had been hidden from the world for decades. "They've been manipulating events on Earth for centuries," the man said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Governments, wars, scientific advancements. It's all part of their plan. We're just pawns in a game we don't understand." I wanted to speak, to ask the questions that were flooding my mind, but I couldn't. The weight of what I had just seen was too much. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of information, unable to find solid ground. The man in the military uniform turned off the screen and stood in silence for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. Then he looked at each of us in turn, his eyes cold and unblinking. "You've now been brought into the inner circle," he said. "What you do with this information is up to you. But know this, if any of you speak a word of this to anyone outside this room, you will disappear, permanently." The room was deathly silent. "Meeting adjourned," the man said, and without another word, he turned and left the room. As I walked out of that briefing, my mind reeling, I knew my life would never be the same. I had been shown the darkest truth imaginable, that humanity was not in control of its own destiny. We were being watched, manipulated, and possibly even harvested by beings far more advanced than we could comprehend. I thought about walking away, leaving the CIA and never looking back. But the more I considered it, the more I realized there was no escape. I was in too deep. The truth was out there, and I had seen it with my own eyes. And now I had to live with it. After that briefing, I couldn't sleep for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that strange, motionless figure in the containment room. It wasn't just the creature itself that haunted me, it was the knowledge that they had been here, right under our noses, for who knows how long. And worse, we were powerless against them. But in the weeks that followed, my unease transformed into something else: obsession. I spent every waking moment poring over the files they'd given us access to. It turned out that the footage we saw in that briefing was just a glimpse of a much larger operation, one that had been running for decades, hidden from the public and even from most government officials. The program was known only by its code name, Blue Horizon. Blue Horizon wasn't just about observing extraterrestrial visitors, it was about fighting them. A silent war that had been waged in the shadows for nearly 50 years, with no end in sight. As I dug deeper into the files, I learned about incidents I had never even heard rumors of. Military engagements with unidentified flying objects, secret weapons programs designed to mimic alien technology, and, most disturbingly, abductions. Not the kind that conspiracy theorists raved about on late-night radio shows, but real documented cases. People vanishing without a trace, only to be returned days or weeks later, their memories wiped, their bodies altered in subtle but terrifying ways. There were thousands of them. One night, as I sat in my office surrounded by stacks of classified documents, I received a call. The voice on the other end was familiar. Agent Hall, one of my only real allies in the agency. She had been with the CIA for nearly as long as I had, and like me, she had been brought into the inner circle after years of service. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Meet me at the safe house." The safe house was a small, unmarked building on the outskirts of the city, a place where agents could meet off the grid. No surveillance, no bugs, just four walls and complete anonymity. I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my coat and headed out. When I arrived, Hall was already there, pacing back and forth in the dimly lit room. She looked worse than I'd ever seen her, dark circles under her eyes, her hair disheveled. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. "What's going on?" I asked, closing the door behind me. "They're hiding something from us," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Something big." I raised an eyebrow. "Bigger than what we've already seen? You're going to have to be more specific." She stopped pacing and turned to face me, her expression deadly serious. "I've been following a new lead," she said, lowering her voice. "Something outside of Blue Horizon, a blacker-than-black project. It's not in the files we have access to, and it's not in the system. But I've got a source, someone who's been feeding me information." I felt a knot form in my stomach. If Hall was going off the books, it meant she was either onto something huge, or she was putting her life in serious danger. Maybe both. "Okay," I said slowly. "What are we talking about here?" She hesitated for a moment, as if weighing the decision to trust me with what she knew. Then, taking a deep breath, she spoke. "They've been making deals with them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I froze. "Deals? What kind of deals?" Hall crossed the room and pulled out a manila folder from her bag. She handed it to me, her hand trembling slightly. "Go ahead," she said, "take a look." I opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. They were heavily redacted with entire pages blacked out, but the bits that were legible painted a disturbing picture. There were references to something called Project Dominion, a classified operation that had supposedly been shut down in the early 80s. But according to the documents Hall had obtained, it hadn't been shut down at all. It had just gone deeper underground. The project was built on a single, horrifying premise: cooperation with extraterrestrial entities in exchange for technology. My hands shook as I read the details. The U.S. government had been allowing the Greys, those emotionless, insect-like beings, to abduct a limited number of humans each year on the condition that they would share their advanced technology with us. Weapons, propulsion systems, medical advancements, it was all there, laid out in cold, clinical language. How long has this been going on? I asked, my voice barely steady. Since Roswell, Hall said grimly. That was the first contact. They offered us a deal and we took it. I felt sick to my stomach. All the abductions, all the disappearances, they had allowed it. They had sold us out. And it gets worse, Hall continued. The Greys aren't the only ones. There are others, other species with their own agendas. We've been playing them off against each other, trying to stay on top of it. But it's spiraling out of control. I closed the folder and looked up at her. Why are you telling me this? Because I need your help, she said, her voice urgent. We need to blow the whistle on this. People need to know. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. What Hall was suggesting wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. If we exposed this, the government would stop at nothing to silence us. And even if we did manage to get the truth out, what then? Panic, riots, wars? The world wasn't ready for this. But as I looked at Hall, I realized she was right. We couldn't stay silent any longer. The price of this secret was too high. What's the plan? I asked, my voice steady. She smiled, but there was no joy in it, only grim determination. First, she said, we're going to need a lot more evidence. The next few weeks were a blur of late-night meetings, encrypted phone calls, and dangerous inquiries. We were digging into the deepest, darkest corners of the CIA's black projects, trying to find anything that could corroborate what Hall's source had told her. It was risky work. Every step we took felt like we were inching closer to the edge of a cliff, one wrong move away from plummeting into oblivion. But we were making progress. Slowly, we started to piece together a clearer picture of Project Dominion, and it was worse than we had imagined. The Greys weren't just abducting humans. They were experimenting on them. Genetic modifications, brain implants, hybridization. And the government knew about it all. We had to be careful, though. We couldn't risk going through the usual channels for fear of being caught. Our work had to remain in the shadows, just like the programs we were investigating. Every time I left my apartment, I checked for tails. Every time I logged into a secure network, I worried that someone was watching. We had no idea how close they were to finding us. But even in those darkest moments, I knew there was no turning back. We were in too deep. The truth was too important. And then, just as we were closing in on the final piece of evidence, everything went wrong. The final piece of evidence came to us in the most unexpected way. Hall had been working her source tirelessly, squeezing every bit of information she could without tipping off the higher-ups. But this time, her contact had delivered something that would blow the entire operation wide open. A classified tape, one that supposedly documented an exchange between U.S. government officials and a representative of the Greys. The tape, Hall explained, had been recorded in the late 1990s during one of the secret meetings at a remote underground facility. According to her source, it was the kind of proof we needed to expose Project Dominion to the world. But getting our hands on it wasn't going to be easy. The plan was simple, on paper at least. We would meet the source in a secure location outside of the city, far from any prying eyes or surveillance. We'd grab the tape, verify its authenticity, and then start planning our next move. Whether that meant handing it over to the press or, if we were lucky enough, taking it straight to the public ourselves. But deep down, I had a bad feeling about it. Something didn't sit right with me. The night of the meeting, Hall and I drove in silence. The safe house was located about an hour outside of town, tucked away in the mountains where no one would think to look. As we wound our way through the narrow roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, that the paranoia was getting to me, but it felt different this time. The air was thick with tension. We arrived at the safe house just before midnight. The building was small and unassuming, barely more than a shack with a single light bulb flickering above the door. We parked a short distance away just in case and approached on foot. "Are you sure about this?" I asked Hall as we reached the door. She nodded, though there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "This is it. We just need to get the tape and get out. It's the break we've been waiting for." I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then we heard movement inside, and the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, with a lean build, and his face was hidden beneath a hood. He looked nervously over his shoulder before ushering us inside. "Do you have it?" Hall asked, her voice low and steady. The man nodded, pulling a small, unmarked envelope from his coat. "It's all here," he said, handing it to her, "but you need to move fast. They're already looking for it." Hall took the envelope, her hands shaking slightly as she opened it. Inside was an old VHS tape, of all things, that looked worn and fragile, as though it had been passed through too many hands. She glanced at me, then back at the man. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Why now?" The man hesitated, glancing around the room like he was being watched. "Because it's time," he said finally. "We've been keeping this under wraps for too long. People need to know the truth, and there's something else." Hall and I exchanged a glance. "They're preparing for something," the man continued. "Something big, bigger than what we've seen before. I don't know all the details, but it has to do with the Greys, and they're not alone this time." "What do you mean they're not alone?" I asked. He lowered his voice, his eyes darting toward the windows. "There are others, other species watching from the shadows. They're aligning themselves, preparing for something. I don't know what, but it's coming soon. The tape, it..." Before he could finish, there was a loud crash from outside. Hall and I spun around, instinctively reaching for our guns. The man's face went pale. "It's them," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Who?" I demanded, grabbing his arm. But before he could answer, the door burst open and 3 armed men in tactical gear stormed into the room. Hall reacted first, drawing her gun and firing a shot into the closest man's chest. He went down hard, but the others were quick, too quick. One of them slammed into Hall, knocking the gun from her hand, while the other grabbed me, pinning my arms behind my back. I struggled, but it was no use. They had us. The man who had given us the tape tried to run, but he didn't make it far. One of the intruders pulled a pistol from his belt and shot him in the back, dropping him to the floor in a pool of blood. "Shut it down," one of the men growled into a radio strapped to his vest. "We've got them." I watched in horror as they ripped the tape from Hall's hands, tossing it onto the floor like it was trash. One of the men stomped on it, shattering it into pieces. "No," Hall screamed, lunging for the remains, but they held her back. "Enough," the man in charge said, stepping forward. His voice was calm, almost bored, as he surveyed the room. "You've seen too much. You're done." "What? What are you going to do with us?" I asked, my voice hoarse from the struggle. He didn't answer. Instead, he nodded to his men, who dragged Hall and me outside. They forced us into the back of an unmarked van, slamming the doors shut behind us. As the van sped away, I felt the weight of our failure settle over me like a heavy blanket. The tape was gone. Our only chance to expose the truth had been destroyed, and now we were at their mercy. We rode in silence, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. Hall sat beside me, her face a mask of rage and despair. I knew what she was thinking because I was thinking it too. We had risked everything, and we had lost. But as the van sped through the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Something was still coming, something bigger, darker, and more dangerous than anything we had imagined. And whatever it was, we were already too late to stop it. The van ride felt endless as the cold metal pressed against my back and the engine hummed beneath us. Every time the tires hit a bump in the road, my heart skipped a beat. Next to me, Hall was quiet, her body tense like a coiled spring ready to explode. We were bound, wrists behind our backs, and the weight of the situation settled heavily between us. They hadn't killed us yet, which meant they wanted something. But what? As I struggled to keep my breathing steady, I replayed the events over and over in my mind. The meeting at the safe house, the source's death, the destruction of the tape. It was all gone, the proof, the evidence we'd so desperately needed. Whoever had planned this, they were 5 steps ahead of us the whole time. Finally, after what felt like hours, the van came to a slow halt. I could hear voices outside, men barking orders, the metallic clank of gates being opened. Then the van door swung open, revealing a dark, deserted parking garage. 2 men, faces obscured by black masks, grabbed us roughly by the arms and pulled us out of the van. The cold air hit my face like a slap. I glanced at Hall, but she refused to meet my eyes. She had always been the stronger one, but even now, I could see the fear lurking behind her hardened expression. "Move," one of the men growled, shoving us forward. They marched us across the garage past rows of unmarked vehicles until we reached a small, nondescript building tucked into the corner. It looked like any other government facility. Gray concrete walls, a single door, no windows. But I knew better. There was nothing normal about this place. The men pushed us through the door and down a narrow corridor. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the white tile floors. The air smelled sterile, like bleach and metal, a place scrubbed clean of any humanity. After a few minutes, we reached a large, reinforced door at the end of the hall. One of the guards swiped a key card, and the door slid open with a heavy thud. Inside was a dimly lit room, furnished only with a long metal table and a few chairs. It looked like an interrogation room, but the walls were lined with strange machinery. Computers, monitors, and devices I couldn't identify. They sat there humming quietly as if watching us. The men forced us into the chairs, binding us tightly to the metal frames. Then, without a word, they stepped back and left the room, the heavy door slamming shut behind them. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was suffocating. "Do you think this is it?" Hall whispered, finally breaking the stillness. I shook my head, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "They still need us for something." Hall's jaw tightened. "They've already taken everything from us. What more could they want?" Before I could answer, the door hissed open again. A man walked in, tall, dressed in a crisp black suit, his features sharp and cold. He had an air of authority about him, the kind that came with years of holding power. He stepped forward slowly, as if savoring the moment, and sat down across from us. For a long time, he didn't speak. He just stared at us, his fingers tapping idly on the table. "You've been very busy," he said finally, his voice smooth and measured. "I've been watching you both for quite some time." Paul stiffened beside me. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded. The man ignored her, his gaze fixed on me. "You don't seem to understand what you've gotten yourselves into," he continued. "Project Dominion is far bigger than either of you realize. You think you've uncovered the truth? You've barely scratched the surface." I clenched my fist beneath the bindings. "So tell us, what is it?" A smile flickered at the corners of his mouth. "Ah, but that's the problem, isn't it? You already know too much, but it's what you don't know that truly matters." Paul leaned forward, her eyes burning with rage. "We know enough to bring this whole operation down." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're very much mistaken. You may have had your little theories, your suspicions, but the truth, the real truth, it's much darker than you could ever imagine." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "What truth?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man's smile faded. "The Greys, the extraterrestrials you've been so obsessed with, they're not here to help us. They never were. In fact, they're just the beginning." My mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. "What do you mean, the beginning?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The Greys are only one piece of the puzzle. They've been working with us, yes, but there are others, more advanced, more dangerous, beings you can't even comprehend. They're watching us, manipulating events, preparing for something far worse than you can imagine." Paul's face paled, but she kept her voice steady. "Why are you telling us this?" The man stood up, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Because it's too late to stop it. The wheels are already in motion. Project Dominion is just the tip of the iceberg. What's coming next? It's inevitable." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused. "You should consider yourselves lucky," he said, glancing back at us. "You won't be around to see the end." With that, he walked out, the door slamming shut behind him once again. Paul and I sat there in stunned silence, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Everything we had fought for, everything we had risked, it had all been for nothing. The truth was far more terrifying than we had ever imagined. And now, there was no escape. The room was plunged into silence once more. But it was a different kind of silence this time, one filled with dread and the gnawing realization that we had stepped into something far more insidious than we could have ever imagined. My thoughts spiraled as I tried to make sense of everything the man had said. The Greys, Project Dominion, it had always seemed monstrous, but this was a level of horror I hadn't even considered. If the Greys were only a fraction of the picture, then what other entities lurked behind the scenes? What darker forces were pulling the strings? "I can't believe it," Paul muttered, her voice trembling for the first time since we'd been captured. "They've been playing us the whole time. The Greys weren't the enemy. They were the distraction." I wanted to tell her that it wasn't true, that this was just some sick psychological game, but I couldn't. Deep down, I knew she was right. Everything we had uncovered, every lead we had chased, it had all been part of a larger plan, and we were pawns. We had been from the start. "They knew we'd find out," I said, my voice hollow. "They let us get just close enough to see the edge of the truth, and then they pulled the rug out from under us." Paul's face twisted with anger. "We can't just sit here and let them win. We need to find a way out. Blow the whistle on all of it." I admired her spirit, but I could hear the futility in my own voice as I responded, "There's no one to blow the whistle to. They've made sure of that. Everything is controlled, watched. Even if we did escape, they'd hunt us down before we got a word out." The cold reality of the situation sank in. We were trapped, caught in a web of secrets that spanned decades, maybe even centuries. And now, with Project Dominion in full swing, there was no stopping whatever came next. Suddenly, the hum of machinery in the room began to change. The lights dimmed further, and a low-frequency vibration filled the air. It felt as though the entire room was pulsing with energy, and I could see the hairs on Hall's arms standing on end. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing hum. I had no answer, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me this was no ordinary sound. Something was happening, something bad. The door to the interrogation room hissed open again, but this time no one entered. Instead, the dim lights from the hallway flickered and then went out, plunging us into complete darkness. "Stay calm," I said, though my own pulse was racing. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, until it felt like my brain was vibrating inside my skull. My vision blurred, and a wave of nausea washed over me. I could barely focus, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw Hall struggling against her restraints, trying to free herself. Then, without warning, a blinding light erupted from the far corner of the room. I blinked against the harsh glow, my eyes watering. A figure appeared within the light, vague and shadowy, but undeniably there. It was tall, humanoid in shape, but there was something off about it. The way it moved was unnatural, fluid, like it was gliding rather than walking. "Do you see that?" Hall's voice was frantic now. "Tell me you see that." "I see it," I whispered, my throat tight with fear. The figure grew clearer as it approached. Its skin, or whatever passed for skin, was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were large, black, and unblinking. It was nothing like the grays we had seen in files and reports. This creature was something else entirely. Something worse. It stood before us, its face inches from mine, and I could feel a cold, oppressive presence radiating from it. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in its gaze. The creature tilted its head slightly as if studying me, and then its voice filled my mind, not spoken aloud, but telepathic, a force that bypassed my ears and went straight to my brain. "You are not meant to see this." I wanted to scream, to yell for help, but no sound came. I could only sit there, locked in place, as the creature's thoughts invaded mine. "Your species is insignificant," it continued, its tone cold and devoid of emotion. "We have observed for centuries. Your kind is a tool, a means to an end. What comes next is beyond your comprehension. You will not survive." I gasped for air, the words hammering against my consciousness. Hall, too, was shaking violently in her chair, her face contorted in terror. The creature moved closer, its grotesque features swimming in the light. "You cannot stop what is coming. You cannot escape your fate." Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to fade. The light receded, and the humming in the room died down to a faint whisper. The oppressive force lifted, and I could finally move again, but my muscles were weak, trembling with fear and exhaustion. Hall collapsed in her chair, gasping for breath. What was that thing?" I shook my head, still too shaken to speak. Whatever it wasn't human. And it wasn't from this world. Before either of us could process what had just happened, the door burst open, and the men in black masks returned, dragging us roughly from the chairs. This time there were no words exchanged, no warnings or threats. They pulled us out of the room, past the hallways, and back into the parking garage. There, a new vehicle was waiting, an unmarked black van. They shoved us inside and slammed the door shut, leaving us in silence once more. I turned to Hall, my voice hoarse. "What now?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stared out the small barred window of the van, her face pale and hollow. There was nothing left to say. We had seen the truth, felt its icy grip, and now we were prisoners of knowledge far beyond our understanding. As the van pulled away, leaving the facility behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by the men in suits or even the grays, but by something far more ancient, something far more powerful. And deep down, I knew there was no going back. The end had already begun,